Ever wonder what separates a problem from a hero? 1 second. In Texas, Rex was the troublesome dog nobody wanted, until an eagle attacked 3-year-old Emily. What happened next challenged everything her grandfather believed about loyalty. A true story of redemption that will make you rethink who truly deserves a second chance. Subscribe to the channel and comment. Where are you watching this story that saved 2 lives in less than 15 seconds? The morning sun cast long shadows across the sprawling Silver Creek Ranch, a 6,000-acre cattle operation nestled in the heart of Texas Hill Country. Dew still clung to the tall prairie grass as Henry Sullivan stood on his weathered front porch, a cup of black coffee steaming in his calloused hand. At 68, Henry's face was a roadmap of deep lines etched by decades under the merciless Texas sun, his skin tanned to the color of saddle leather. Despite his age, he stood tall and firm, with shoulders broadened by years of hard work and eyes that missed nothing happening on his land. "That damn dog's gone and done it again, Frank," Henry grumbled to his foreman, who stood beside him, watching a commotion near the cattle pens. "Third time this month." In the distance, several ranch hands were scrambling to round up a scattered herd of Herefords. Among them, a large German shepherd darted back and forth, barking fiercely. The dog, Rex, was a magnificent specimen. His black and tan coat gleamed in the sun, his powerful frame built for speed and endurance. But there was a wildness in his amber eyes that refused to be tamed. Frank Delgado, who had worked at Silver Creek for over 20 years, sighed and adjusted his worn Stetson. "He's got good instincts, boss. Just doesn't know how to channel them right." "Instincts don't mean squat if he can't follow orders," Henry retorted, setting his coffee mug down with a sharp clink. "That dog's cost me more in spooked cattle and broken fences than he's worth." Down by the pens, Jake Martinez, the youngest ranch hand, was trying to calm Rex, who continued to bark and circle aggressively around the cattle. "Rex, down boy, heel," Jake commanded, his voice strained with frustration. Rex hesitated, looking at Jake with intelligent eyes that seemed to consider the command before deliberately ignoring it. The dog resumed his frantic barking, causing more panic among the cattle. "I've made up my mind," Henry said, his voice hardening with resolve. "Call the shelter in San Antonio. That dog's gotta go before he hurts someone or ruins a whole season's profit." Frank's weathered face creased with concern. "You sure about that, Henry? He came from your brother's best breeding line. Might just need more time." Henry's jaw tightened as he watched Rex snap at the heels of a prized bull, nearly causing the massive animal to crash through a wooden fence. "My brother's been gone 3 years now, and I've given that dog every chance. Some animals just can't be trained right. He's too wild, too stubborn. I've got a ranch to run." "What about your granddaughter?" "Emily loves that dog something fierce," Frank ventured carefully. Henry's expression softened slightly at the mention of his 3-year-old granddaughter, but he quickly hardened again. "Emily's too young to understand. Better she learns now that life ain't always fair. Besides, she's only here visiting for the summer. She'll forget about him once she's back with her mama in Dallas." As if to punctuate Henry's decision, a loud crash echoed across the ranch as a section of fencing gave way under the pressure of the frightened cattle. Rex stood in the middle of the chaos, barking triumphantly, oblivious to the damage he'd caused. "That does it," Henry said, turning to go back inside. "Call the shelter. I want him gone by the end of the week." The following day dawned clear and crisp, with a gentle breeze carrying the sweet scent of wildflowers across Silver Creek Ranch. It was the kind of perfect spring morning that seemed to hold endless possibilities, especially through the eyes of a child. Little Emily Sullivan sat cross-legged in the lush green grass of her grandfather's front yard, her golden curls catching sunlight like a halo around her cherubic face. At just 3 years old, she possessed the curious spirit and fearless nature that often made Henry both proud and terrified. Dressed in tiny denim overalls and a pink t-shirt with embroidered butterflies, she was carefully arranging a collection of colorful stones she had gathered from the driveway. "Look, Sarah, this one's purple like your necklace," Emily exclaimed, holding up a smooth amethyst-colored pebble to her babysitter, her blue eyes wide with wonder. Sarah Matthews, a 22-year-old college student who worked at the ranch during summer breaks, smiled distractedly as she spread a checkered blanket on the grass nearby. "That's beautiful, Em. We'll put it in your special collection jar when we go inside. Sarah had been Emily's caretaker since the little girl arrived for her summer stay 3 weeks ago. With Emily's mother, Henry's daughter, busy with her legal practice in Dallas, it fell to Sarah to watch over the energetic toddler. Today, she was organizing a surprise picnic lunch to cheer up Emily, who had been asking about Rex all morning. "Where's Rexy? I want to give him my sandwich crusts," Emily asked, abandoning her stones to peer around the yard. Sarah hesitated, carefully arranging small containers of fruit and cookies on the blanket. "Rex is helping the cowboys with the cows today, sweetie. Very important dog business." The truth was that Sarah knew Henry had scheduled for Rex to be picked up that afternoon. She'd been instructed not to mention it to Emily, a task that weighed heavily on her conscience. "Can we go see him after lunch?" Emily persisted, now wandering toward the white picket fence that separated the main yard from the path leading to the barns. "We'll see, honey. First, let's get this picnic ready. I made your favorite, peanut butter and strawberry jelly," Sarah called, turning to retrieve the basket she'd left on the porch steps. She didn't notice Emily push experimentally against the fence gate, finding it unlatched. Inside the house, Henry was on the phone with the cattle buyer, his voice drifting through the open windows. "No, Johnson, I won't take a penny less than market price. These are prime Herefords we're talking about." Emily, seeing that Sarah was distracted with the picnic preparations, felt the irresistible pull of adventure that only a 3-year-old can truly understand. The gate swung open with a gentle creak, and she slipped through the opening. Freedom beckoned in the form of the distant meadow, where colorful Texas wildflowers, bluebonnets, Indian paintbrushes, and black-eyed Susans created a natural rainbow against the horizon. "I'll find Rexy myself," she whispered with childish determination, her tiny cowgirl boots leaving small imprints in the soft dirt as she toddled away from the safety of the yard. Sarah, still arranging the picnic and humming softly to herself, remained unaware that her young charge had wandered off. The breeze picked up slightly, ruffling the corners of the blanket and momentarily claiming her attention as she placed a stone on each corner to hold it down. "Emily, lunch is almost ready," she called, not yet looking up. "Would you like apple juice or lemonade today?" Only the rustling of the oak trees and the distant lowing of cattle answered her question. High above Silver Creek Ranch, riding the thermal currents that rose from the sun-warmed Texas earth, soared a magnificent golden eagle. With a wingspan stretching nearly 8 feet tip to tip, the raptor was an impressive sight against the clear blue sky, though few humans ever noticed its presence. The eagle's feathers gleamed with a burnished gold in the morning light, and its piercing eyes, capable of spotting movement from over 2 miles away, scanned the landscape below with predatory intensity. This particular eagle was a female, larger and more aggressive than her male counterparts. She had established her territory in the limestone cliffs bordering the western edge of the Sullivan property years ago. Normally, she would hunt jackrabbits and ground squirrels in the surrounding hills, but this past winter had been unusually harsh. Game had become scarce, and she had 4 hungry eaglets waiting in her cliffside nest. The eagle banked sharply, riding an updraft that carried her higher into the sky. Her keen eyes detected movement in every direction, a jackrabbit darting between sagebrush patches, a rattlesnake slithering across sun-baked rocks, and the lumbering forms of cattle in their pens. But something else caught her attention, something small and bright, moving slowly across an open meadow. The raptor's instincts sharpened. The movement pattern was vulnerable, unsuspecting. Her powerful wings adjusted, holding her position as she assessed the situation. The small form below was isolated, away from the cluster of buildings and the larger creatures that typically surrounded it. Hunger gnawed at her. It had been 3 days since her last successful hunt, and her young needed food. Down below, oblivious to the dangers circling overhead, Emily continued her determined journey through the meadow. She stopped occasionally to pick wildflowers, adding them to the small bouquet clutched in her tiny fist. "Rexy will like these," she said to herself, the childish lisp in her voice making the dog's name sound like Wexy. She held the flowers up to her nose, inhaling their sweet fragrance, completely unaware of the shadow that briefly passed over her. The eagles circled lower, her extraordinary vision allowing her to see every detail of the small human child. The golden curls, the bright clothes, the slow, unsteady movement. Most importantly, the eagle registered the absence of any larger humans nearby. Under normal circumstances, the bird would never approach human settlements or consider a human child as prey. But hunger and the instinct to provide for her young overrode her usual caution. She had occasionally snatched lambs and even small calves in desperate times. This small human was no larger than the kid goats she sometimes took from neighboring ranches. The eagle's decision was made in that moment of primal calculation, a predator's assessment of risk versus reward. Back at the ranch house, Sarah had finally noticed Emily's absence. Panic surged through her as she scanned the empty yard, her eyes falling on the unlatched gate swinging gently in the breeze. "Emily," she called, her voice rising with alarm. "Emily, where are you, sweetie?" She rushed to the gate, her heart pounding as she looked out across the expanse of the ranch. In the distance, she could just make out a small figure in the meadow, surrounded by wildflowers, unaware of any danger. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, breaking into a run. But she was still hundreds of yards away, too far to reach the child quickly. Henry stepped onto the porch, drawn by Sarah's panicked calls. "What's happening?" he demanded, his weathered face clouding with concern. "It's Emily. She's wandered into the south meadow." Sarah pointed frantically as she ran. Henry's eyes narrowed as he scanned the horizon, years of ranching having taught him to notice things others might miss. His breath caught in his throat as he spotted not just his granddaughter, but also the distinctive silhouette of the eagle circling lower and lower in the sky above her. "Dear God, no," he breathed, reaching for his rifle by the door, knowing even as he did that he was too far away to help. The eagle tucked her wings closer to her body, her talons extending as she prepared to strike. In an instant, the eagle transformed from a distant speck in the sky to a missile of feathers and talons. With wings tucked tightly against her powerful body, the raptor began her descent, picking up speed with each passing second. The dive was executed with the precision that comes from years of successful hunts, a deadly efficiency honed by evolution and necessity. The wind whistled past the eagle's streamlined form as she plummeted toward the unsuspecting child below. Her yellow eyes remained fixed on her target, making micro-adjustments to her trajectory to compensate for the slight breeze. She was a perfect killing machine, designed by nature for this exact moment. The swift, silent approach followed by the surprise attack. Emily, still engrossed in her collection of wildflowers, had wandered further into the meadow. She knelt down to pluck a particularly vibrant Indian paintbrush, adding it to her growing bouquet. "This red one's for Grandpa," she murmured to herself, "and this blue one's for Rexy." The shadow above her grew larger but remained unnoticed by the child. The only warning of the approaching danger was a subtle shift in the ambient sounds, the sudden silence of the meadow birds, the abrupt cessation of insect chirping, as if the entire natural world was holding its breath in anticipation of the violence to come. Back at the ranch house, Sarah sprinted across the yard, her lungs burning as she pushed herself to run faster than she ever had before. "Emily," she screamed, her voice carried away by the wind. "Emily, don't move." But the distance was too great, her voice too faint to reach the little girl. Sarah's stomach twisted with dread as she saw the eagle's dive begin. She knew she wouldn't make it in time. Henry had bolted from the porch, rifle in hand. But even as he ran toward the meadow, the cold reality of the situation sank in. He was too far away, the eagle too fast. A shot at this distance would be as likely to hit his granddaughter as the bird. Desperation clawed at his chest as he bellowed for help. "Frank, Jake, anybody." The south meadow, his voice, powerful as it was, only reached the nearest barn, where two ranch hands looked up in confusion before spotting Henry running and immediately giving chase, not yet understanding what had triggered the emergency. At the cattle pens on the opposite side of the property, Jake Martinez was securing Rex in a holding kennel ahead of the shelter pickup scheduled for that afternoon. The young ranch hand had just latched the gate when he heard the distant commotion. "What's going on?" he muttered, straining to hear the shouted words carried faintly on the breeze. Rex's ears suddenly pricked forward, his entire body tensing as if electrified. Though too far away for human ears to detect, the German shepherd's sensitive hearing had picked up something. Perhaps Emily's voice, perhaps the distinctive sound of the eagle's wings cutting through air, or perhaps some primal instinct that transcended explanation. Whatever it was, the change in the dog was immediate and dramatic. In the meadow, Emily finally sensed something amiss. Perhaps it was the darkening shadow, or some vestigial survival instinct buried deep in her human DNA. But she looked up just as the eagle entered the final phase of its attack. The little girl's blue eyes widened in terror, her bouquet of wildflowers dropping from suddenly limp fingers as she froze in fear. The eagle's talons extended fully, deadly curved weapons reaching for the small child. The bird's approach was perfectly silent, a lethal ghost dropping from the sky. In the last moment before impact, the sunlight glinted off the raptor's feathers, turning them into a blaze of gold and brown. Emily couldn't even scream. Her tiny body was locked in place by fear so profound it transcended voice or movement. In that frozen moment, she was completely alone, completely vulnerable, with no one close enough to prevent what was about to happen. The eagle's shadow engulfed her completely as the massive bird closed the final feet of its deadly dive, talons aimed directly at the small child's shoulders. Time seemed to stretch and distort in these final seconds, as if the universe itself was reluctant to witness what would happen next. At the holding kennel on the far side of the ranch, Rex exploded into action. One moment he was standing alert, ears forward and body tense. The next, he hurled himself against the metal gate with such force that the entire structure shuddered. His normally handsome face contorted into a mask of determination, teeth bared and hackles raised along his powerful spine. Jake jumped back in surprise. "Whoa, easy boy." But Rex was beyond hearing human commands now. Something primal had awakened in him, a protective instinct more powerful than any training or discipline. He rammed the gate again, his muscular body a battering ram of fur and sinew. On the third impact, the latch, old and weakened from years of use, finally gave way with a metallic snap. Before Jake could react, Rex burst through the opening and took off across the ranch at a full sprint. His powerful legs propelled him forward with astonishing speed, eating up the ground between the kennels and the distant meadow where Emily stood frozen in terror. "Rex, come back," Jake shouted uselessly, watching in amazement as the dog cleared a 3-foot fence without breaking stride. Rex ran like he had never run before. His paws barely seemed to touch the ground as he streaked across the property. Ranch hands stopped to stare as the German shepherd flew past them, a blur of black and tan moving with single-minded purpose. Some would later swear they'd never seen any animal move that fast. With each bound, Rex's nose told him a complex story. Emily's scent trail leading away from the house, the disturbed wildflowers where she had walked, and something else. The unmistakable musk of a large predator bird carried on the breeze. His keen ears picked up the faint sounds of commotion, Sarah's distant calls, Henry's shouts, and most importantly, the terrifying absence of sound where Emily should be. As he crested the small rise that separated the ranch buildings from the south meadow, Rex finally caught sight of the unfolding danger. His already rapid pace somehow increased, muscles burning with the effort as instinct and adrenaline drove him beyond normal canine limits. Henry, still running toward the meadow with his rifle clutched uselessly in his hands, spotted the dog racing past him. "Rex?" he gasped in disbelief. The German shepherd paid him no attention, focused entirely on the scene ahead. In that moment, all of Rex's previous disobedience, all his willfulness and stubbornness, revealed themselves for what they truly were. Not defiance, but independence. Not aggression, but protective instinct waiting for its true purpose. Time seemed to compress as Rex calculated distance and trajectory with an intelligence that transcended conscious thought. The eagle was mere seconds from striking Emily. The dog's path would intersect with the attack at exactly the right moment, if he could maintain his incredible speed for just a few more seconds. Emily remained frozen in place, her small face upturned toward the descending predator, too frightened even to scream. The eagle's massive wingspan blocked out the sun as it made its final approach, talons extended like deadly hooks reaching for the child. In those critical final moments, Rex's powerful legs drove him forward in a desperate burst of speed. His muscles burned with exertion, his heart pounded against his ribs, but something beyond physical strength pushed him onward. A connection to the small human who had slipped him treats under the dinner table, who had wrapped her tiny arms around his neck when no one was looking, who had whispered, "I love you, Rexy," when they thought he was asleep on the porch. The ranch hands who witnessed what happened next would talk about it for years to come. Rex, launching himself into the air with a final, powerful leap at the exact moment the eagle would have struck. His timing was flawless, his calculation perfect. The magnificent dog seemed to fly through the air, his body a shield between predator and child. As Sarah finally reached the edge of the meadow, her scream caught in her throat at the sight before her. Rex, airborne and magnificent, intercepting a danger none of them had seen coming until it was almost too late. The impact was explosive. Rex's 80-pound body collided with the eagle in midair, just feet above Emily's head. The sound was unlike anything the ranch hands had ever heard. A combination of furious barking, the eagle's surprised screech, and the violent rustle of powerful wings beating in desperation. Rex's calculations had been perfect. His body curled protectively around Emily as they both tumbled to the ground, the dog deliberately positioning himself to absorb the brunt of the impact. The little girl's terrified cry was muffled against his thick fur as they rolled through the wildflowers. The eagle, momentarily stunned by the unexpected interference, recovered quickly. Powerful wings extending to their full 8-foot span, the bird regained altitude and circled tightly, reluctant to abandon her intended prey. Her predatory instincts, honed over years of successful hunts, would not allow her to retreat without a fight. Rex scrambled to his feet, positioning himself over Emily, who lay curled in a frightened ball amidst the crushed wildflowers. His hackles stood rigid along his spine, teeth bared in a snarl that rumbled deep from his chest. Blood matted the fur on his shoulder where the eagle's talons had scored deep gashes during the collision. "Stay down, sweet girl." He seemed to communicate to Emily with his body language, pressing her gently to the ground with his protective stance. The eagle circled once, twice, then dove again, this time with Rex as her intended target. The massive bird's talons extended toward the dog's exposed back, yellow eyes fixed with predatory focus. But Rex was ready. As the eagle descended, he launched himself upward with a ferocity that belied his injuries. His powerful jaws snapped at the bird's wing, catching the outer edge of the primary feathers. The eagle screeched in pain and surprise, her attack disrupted by the unexpected counterstrike. Henry had finally reached the edge of the meadow, rifle raised, but useless with Rex and Emily so close to the eagle. "My God," he whispered, watching the life and death struggle unfolding before him. Rex never took his eyes off the predator circling above. Blood dripped from his shoulder wounds, staining the wildflowers crimson beneath his paws, but he showed no sign of backing down. His body remained positioned over Emily, who whimpered in fear. "Rexy," she sobbed, her tiny hands clutching at his fur. Rexy hurt. The eagle, frustrated by Rex's defense but still driven by hunger, banked sharply and prepared for another attack. This time, she approached from a different angle, using the blinding sun at her back to obscure her approach. Rex, however, tracked her by sound and scent more than sight. His ears pivoted to follow her movement, his nose testing the shifting air currents. When the eagle dove a third time, he was already turning to meet the threat. Their collision was even more violent than the first. The eagle's talons raked across Rex's already wounded shoulder, but the dog managed to clamp his jaws around the bird's leg. Both animals tumbled in a whirlwind of feathers and fur, neither willing to concede defeat. Sarah had reached Emily now and snatched the child up from beneath Rex's protective stance, pulling her away from the dangerous struggle. "I've got you, baby," she sobbed, clutching Emily tightly against her chest as she retreated. Freed from his responsibility to shield the child, Rex focused entirely on the fight. Blood streamed from new wounds on his flank, but adrenaline and protective instinct dulled the pain. The eagle, realizing her prey was now beyond reach and facing a determined defender, began to disengage, beating her powerful wings to gain altitude. Rex, sensing victory, made one final lunge and caught the eagle's wing firmly in his jaws. There was a sickening crack as the delicate bones gave way under the pressure of his bite. The eagle screeched in agony, twisting desperately to free herself. "That's enough, Rex," Henry shouted, finally close enough to intervene. "Let her go, boy." Whether Rex understood the command or simply decided the threat was neutralized, he released his grip. The eagle, one wing now hanging awkwardly, struggled to gain altitude, managing only an ungainly retreat toward the distant hills. Rex stood triumphant but severely wounded in the center of the trampled wildflowers, his sides heaving with exertion. Blood matted his coat in several places, but his eyes remained alert, tracking the eagle's retreat until she was a distant speck against the horizon. Only then did he turn to look at Emily, safely clutched in Sarah's arms, his tail offering a single exhausted wag. The aftermath of the attack descended upon the meadow like a sudden storm. Ranch hands converged from all directions, drawn by the commotion and Henry's frantic calls. What they found was a scene of both violence and unexpected heroism. Trampled wildflowers stained with blood, feathers scattered across the grass, and at the center of it all, Rex standing wounded but vigilant. "Someone get Dr. Walker on the phone," Henry commanded, referencing the local veterinarian who served most of the ranches in the county. "Tell him it's an emergency." Frank Delgado was already on his cell phone, his weathered hands shaking slightly as he punched in the number. "Doc, we need you at Silver Creek right away. Got a dog torn up pretty bad by an eagle." As the initial chaos subsided, attention turned to Rex's injuries. The German Shepherd had finally allowed himself to collapse onto his side, his breathing labored but steady. The wounds across his shoulders and back were deep, for parallel gashes where the eagle's talons had ripped through skin and muscle. Blood continued to seep from the wounds, matting his once glossy coat. Henry knelt beside the dog, all thoughts of sending him away forgotten in the face of Rex's extraordinary courage. "You hang in there, boy," he murmured, gently placing his hand on the dog's head. "You're not going anywhere but home." Rex's amber eyes, clouded with pain but still alert, met Henry's. The dog's tail thumped weakly against the ground in acknowledgement. Jake Martinez had arrived with his truck, the back already prepared with blankets for transporting the injured animal. "Should we move him, boss?" Henry nodded grimly. "Careful now. Don't jostle those wounds more than necessary." It took 4 men to lift Rex onto the blankets, each movement drawing a whimper of pain from the stoic animal. As they prepared to load him into the truck, Emily broke free from Sarah's protective embrace and ran to Rex's side. "Rexy hurt," she cried, tears streaming down her dirt-streaked face. Her small hand reached out to touch his muzzle. "Rexy saved me from the big bird." Rex, despite his pain, managed to lift his head slightly at the sound of Emily's voice. His tongue flicked out weakly, licking her tiny fingers in a gesture of reassurance. "That's right, sweetheart," Henry said, his own voice thick with emotion as he knelt beside his granddaughter. "Rex is a hero, and heroes need doctors when they get hurt fighting the bad guys." Emily nodded solemnly, her 3-year-old mind processing this information with surprising clarity. "Will the doctor make Rexy all better?" Henry exchanged a glance with Frank, both men aware of the severity of Rex's injuries. The talons of a golden eagle were designed to pierce the tough hide of jackrabbits and even young deer. The damage to Rex's muscle and tissue would be significant. "The doctor will do everything he can," Henry answered honestly. "Rex is strong and brave. He's a fighter." As they carefully loaded Rex into the truck, the dog's eyes never left Emily. Even in his pain, his protective instinct remained firmly fixed on the child he had saved. The drive back to the ranch house seemed eternally long, though it was less than a mile. Jake drove with uncharacteristic caution, avoiding every bump and dip in the ranch road. In the bed of the truck, Henry sat with Rex's head cradled in his lap, one hand gently stroking the dog's ears while the other applied pressure to the worst of the wounds with a clean towel. "I had you all wrong, didn't I, boy?" Henry murmured, his voice too low for the others to hear. "All this time, you weren't being difficult. You were just waiting for something that mattered enough to protect." Rex's tail thumped once against the blankets in what Henry chose to interpret as agreement. Dr. Walker was already waiting when they reached the ranch house, his weathered pickup truck with its medical supplies parked by the front steps. The veterinarian, a tall man with prematurely white hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, quickly assessed the situation as they carried Rex to the shade of the front porch. "Eagle attack, you say?" he asked, kneeling to examine the wounds. "Nasty business. I've seen what those birds can do to calves." He looked up at Henry, his expression grave. He's lost a lot of blood, Henry. Do whatever you need to do, Doc, Henry replied firmly. Price is no object. As Dr. Walker began cleaning and treating Rex's wounds, administering antibiotics and pain medication, the German Shepherd remained remarkably calm. His eyes, though clouded with pain, maintained their alert intelligence, tracking the movements of everyone around him, but always returning to Emily, who sat on the porch steps watching with tearful concern. Will he make it? Henry asked quietly when Emily was momentarily distracted by Sarah. Dr. Walker's hands never paused in their work as he replied, If determination counts for anything, he will. I've never seen a dog with such fight in him. News of the eagle attack spread through Silver Creek Ranch like wildfire, transforming an ordinary spring day into one that would become legend in the years to come. The main house buzzed with frantic activity as ranch hands came and went, their usual stoic demeanors replaced by expressions of shock and concern. Dust clouds rose from the driveway as trucks pulled in, carrying workers from the far reaches of the property who had heard snippets of the story over radio calls. Inside the ranch house, Emily sat in the large kitchen, perched on a wooden chair with her legs dangling, a mug of hot chocolate clutched in her small hands. Sarah hadn't left her side since the attack, her face still pale with the lingering shock of what had nearly happened. She didn't even cry after we got back to the house, Sarah explained in hushed tones to Maggie, the ranch cook who had worked for the Sullivan family for over 30 years. Just keeps asking about Rex. Maggie clucked her tongue as she pulled a fresh batch of cookies from the oven, Emily's favorite chocolate chip, hoping to provide some comfort to the child. Shock, most likely. Poor little lamb doesn't fully understand how close it was. Out on the covered porch that wrapped around 3 sides of the sprawling ranch house, Dr. Walker continued his careful work on Rex. He had converted the space into a makeshift veterinary clinic, his black medical bag open beside him, instruments laid out on a clean white towel. Henry stood nearby, his hat in his hands, watching every movement with anxious intensity. The deepest talon wound missed his spine by less than an inch, Dr. Walker explained as he stitched one of the gashes. Lucky dog. If it had hit the vertebrae, he didn't need to finish the sentence. Henry nodded grimly, his weathered face drawn with concern. In his 68 years of ranching, he'd seen animals injured in countless ways, gored by bulls, bitten by rattlesnakes, caught in barbed wire, but never anything like this. 7 stitches on this shoulder wound, 12 on the back, and this last one will need at least 10, Dr. Walker continued, his steady hands moving with practiced precision. He'll have some impressive scars to show for his heroics. Frank Delgado pushed through the screen door, holding a satellite phone in his hand. Got a call from the Fish and Wildlife Service, he reported to Henry. They're sending someone out tomorrow to take a statement about the eagle. Apparently, attacks on humans are rare enough that they document each one. Henry nodded absently, his attention still fixed on Rex. The German Shepherd lay still under Dr. Walker's ministrations, heavily sedated but breathing steadily. Through the window, they could hear Emily's small voice drifting from the kitchen. When can I see Rexy again? Good Lord, Henry whispered, running a hand over his face. If that dog hadn't. He couldn't bring himself to complete the thought. Frank placed a hand on his boss's shoulder. But he did, Henry. He did. Jake Martinez burst through the front door, his young face flushed with excitement. You won't believe this. I just found the tracking collar we put on that eagle last year for the conservation project. The data shows she's been hunting closer and closer to the ranch house for weeks. The drought, Dr. Walker commented without looking up from his work, drove away her normal prey. I've been seeing more predators near settlements this spring, coyotes in town, mountain lions down from the hills. A sudden commotion erupted from the driveway as a sleek black SUV skidded to a halt in a cloud of dust. The door flew open before the vehicle had fully stopped, and a woman in her 30s jumped out, her face a mask of panic. Mom, Emily called from inside the house. Carolyn Sullivan, Henry's daughter, raced up the porch steps, her designer boots unsuited for the ranch gravel, her city clothes stark against the rural backdrop. Where is she? Where's Emily? Her voice cracked with fear. She's fine, Carolyn, Henry said, stepping forward to intercept his daughter before she could see the bloody scene around Rex. She's in the kitchen with Sarah and Maggie. Not a scratch on her. Carolyn sagged against her father in relief. Frank called and said something about an eagle attack. I left court in the middle of a hearing and drove straight here. She pulled back, her eyes, the same bright blue as Emily's, searching her father's face. What happened? As Henry led Carolyn inside to reunite with her daughter, Dr. Walker finished the last of the stitches and began bandaging Rex's wounds. He'll need rest and antibiotics, careful monitoring for infection, he instructed Frank, who remained on the porch. Those bandages need changing twice daily. We'll tend to him like he was one of our own children, Frank assured him. Inside, the kitchen had become the focal point of the ranch's collective relief and lingering fear. Emily was wrapped in her mother's tight embrace, recounting the event with the disjointed narrative of a 3-year-old. The big bird was coming down fast, Mommy. But Rexy jumped really high and saved me. Her small hands gestured dramatically, showing the eagle's dive. Rexy got owies from the big bird's claws. Carolyn looked over her daughter's head to her father, her eyes wide with horror at the realization of how close she had come to losing her only child. Is that the dog you were planning to send away? She asked quietly. Henry's face colored slightly with shame. Yes, the shelter was supposed to pick him up this afternoon. He hesitated, then added with firm resolution, that's not happening now. Not ever. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the old clock above the stove and the distant sound of Dr. Walker's truck starting up as he prepared to leave, promising to return the next day to check on his patient. Through the kitchen window, they could see Rex, now bandaged and resting on a thick blanket on the porch, still under sedation, but looking somehow regal even in his injured state. That dog, Henry said, his voice thick with emotion, just became a permanent member of this family. 3 days after the eagle attack, the atmosphere at Silver Creek Ranch had undergone a profound transformation. Where chaos and panic had reigned, a quieter, more reflective mood now settled over the property like the gentle morning mist that clung to the hills. Henry Sullivan sat in his favorite rocking chair on the east porch, where the first rays of the Texas sunrise warmed the weathered wood. A cup of coffee cooled beside him, largely forgotten as he watched Rex, who lay on a thick quilt a few feet away. The German shepherd's wounds were hidden beneath clean bandages, changed faithfully twice daily as Dr. Walker had instructed. Though still weak from blood loss and the trauma of his injuries, Rex remained alert, his amber eyes tracking the movements of everyone who approached the house, especially Emily. You know, I've been thinking about my brother a lot these past few days, Henry said quietly to Frank, who leaned against the porch railing nearby. Jack always said this dog was special. He's not meant for herding cattle, Henry, he told me. He's got a different purpose. Frank nodded, sipping from his own coffee mug. Jack knew his dogs, had an eye for picking out the ones with something extra. The screen door creaked open as Carolyn stepped out onto the porch, her city clothes exchanged for worn jeans and a faded flannel shirt, remnants of her own ranching childhood that she kept at her father's house for visits. Emily's finally asleep, she said, settling into the chair next to her father's. She insisted on drawing another picture for Rex before her nap. She held up a colorful crayon drawing that showed a large brown dog standing triumphantly over a bird, with a small yellow-haired figure beside it. That's the 4th one today. Henry chuckled softly. Better add them to the collection. He gestured to a small pile of similar artwork already stacked on the side table. A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the gentle creak of Henry's rocking chair. Rex's tail thumped weakly against his quilt at the mention of Emily's name. Dad, Carolyn began hesitantly. I've been thinking about what happened, about how close it was. Her voice wavered slightly. If Rex hadn't been here, if he'd already been taken away, don't, Henry interrupted, his weathered hand reaching out to cover his daughter's. We can't think that way. What matters is that he was here, that he somehow knew. Rex lifted his head at the mention of his name, his ears perking forward attentively. The Fish and Wildlife officer said she'd never documented a case of a dog intervening in an eagle attack, Frank added. Said it was like Rex understood exactly what was happening and knew precisely what to do. Henry nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the dog who had saved his granddaughter's life. I misjudged him. All this time, I thought his independence was stubbornness, his alertness was aggression. He shook his head regretfully. I was blind to what was right in front of me. What do you mean? Carolyn asked. Rex was never meant to be a herding dog, Henry explained, echoing his brother's words. That's why he didn't respond well to those commands. He wasn't bred for moving cattle. He was bred to be a protector. As if understanding the conversation, Rex attempted to stand, managing to get to his feet despite his injuries. Though unsteady, he walked the few steps to Henry's chair and rested his head on the old rancher's knee. Henry's calloused hand gently stroked the dog's head, careful to avoid the bandages. You knew your purpose all along, didn't you, boy? You were just waiting for the moment when it really mattered. Dr. Walker's truck appeared in the distance, dust rising behind it as it made its way up the long driveway for the daily checkup on his patient. He's making good progress, Carolyn observed. Dr. Walker seemed impressed yesterday. He's a fighter, Henry agreed. Got more heart than most humans I know. The screen door banged open again as Emily, apparently having abandoned her nap, burst onto the porch in her pajamas, her blonde curls wild around her face. Rexy, she exclaimed, immediately dropping to her knees beside the dog. With surprising gentleness for a 3-year-old, she stroked his muzzle, carefully avoiding his injuries. Rex responded with a soft whine of pleasure, his tail thumping more vigorously against the porch boards. I made you another picture, Emily informed the dog seriously. It's you and me playing ball when you get better. Emily, Carolyn began. Rex needs to rest to heal his owies, remember? The little girl nodded solemnly. I'm being careful, Mommy. Rexy knows. Indeed, the German Shepherd showed no signs of distress at the child's presence. Instead, he seemed to draw energy from her, his posture straightening despite his wounds. Henry watched the interaction with a mixture of wonder and lingering guilt. I was going to send him away, he said quietly to his daughter. Had the shelter all arranged. But you didn't, Carolyn reminded him gently. Not for the right reasons, Henry admitted. It was just luck that he was still here when he couldn't finish the sentence. Perhaps it wasn't luck at all, Frank suggested from his position by the railing. My grandmother used to say that dogs see things we can't, that they understand more than we give them credit for. As Dr. Walker's truck pulled up to the house, Henry made a decision that had been forming in his mind since the moment Rex had launched himself between Emily and the eagle. Carolyn, he said, his voice taking on the firm tone that his daughter recognized from childhood. I want you and Emily to stay at the ranch longer than planned. And when you do go back to Dallas, I want Rex to go with you. Carolyn looked at her father in surprise. You want us to take Rex? Henry nodded, watching as Emily whispered secrets into the dog's attentive ear. That dog has one purpose in life now, and it's lying right there beside him. They belong together. For the first time in 3 days, Rex barked, a short, affirmative sound that made them all smile. I think he agrees with your decision, Dad, Carolyn said, wiping away an unexpected tear. 6 weeks after the eagle attack, Silver Creek Ranch basked in the golden light of a Texas summer evening. The day's work was done, the cattle settled in their pastures, and a peaceful quiet had descended over the sprawling property. On the wide front porch of the main house, Henry Sullivan stood with his hands resting on the weathered railing, watching the scene before him with quiet satisfaction. In the yard, Rex bounded across the grass, his powerful body fully healed from his injuries. Though four distinctive scars remained visible through his fur where the eagle's talons had struck, they didn't slow him down in the slightest. The German Shepherd moved with fluid grace, his attention entirely focused on the small blonde figure giggling and running a few steps ahead of him. Catch me, Rexy, Emily called, her voice carrying on the evening breeze. Rex played his part perfectly, staying just close enough to maintain the game, but never overtaking the child. When Emily suddenly changed direction, Rex adjusted instantly, his amber eyes never leaving her. To the casual observer, it might have looked like simple play, but Henry recognized it for what it really was, protection disguised as fun. He doesn't let her get more than 10 feet away from him, Frank observed, joining Henry at the railing. Been that way since he got back on his feet. Henry nodded. Doc Walker says it's unusual. Says most dogs would be wary of children after recovering from an injury. Not Rex. If anything, he's more attached to her than before. Inside the house, they could see Carolyn through the window, packing the last of Emily's toys into a large suitcase. Tomorrow morning, mother and daughter would return to Dallas after extending their stay by nearly 2 months. You still sure about sending Rex with them? Frank asked, though he already knew the answer. Never been more sure of anything, Henry replied without hesitation. That dog and that little girl have a connection that goes beyond anything I can explain. As if sensing he was being discussed, Rex looked up toward the porch, his ears perked forward attentively. Even in this moment of apparent distraction, his body remained positioned between Emily and the open space of the ranch, a living shield, constantly alert. Got his new collar and tags yesterday, Henry continued. City license, rabies tag, the works. Even got him one of those fancy GPS trackers. He chuckled softly. Carolyn's got their backyard fenced with 6-foot privacy panels, but I told her Rex isn't one to be contained if he thinks Emily needs him. You think he'll adjust to city living? Frank wondered. Dallas is a long way from ranch life. Henry watched as Rex gently herded Emily back toward the house when she strayed too close to the flower beds near the edge of the yard. That dog doesn't care where he is, as long as he's with her. The screen door creaked open as Carolyn stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on her jeans. Well, that's the last of the packing. Everything's ready for tomorrow. She leaned against the railing beside her father, watching her daughter play. I've enrolled Rex in protection dog certification classes. The trainer nearly fell over when I told him what happened with the eagle. Said he's never heard of a dog intervening in a raptor attack before. He's one of a kind, Henry agreed. The real estate agent called today, Carolyn added. Found us a house with a bigger yard, closer to a park. It'll be ready next month. She smiled as she watched Rex nudge Emily away from a patch of ground that housed a small anthill. I told her Rex needs room to run. Henry placed an arm around his daughter's shoulders, feeling a sudden swell of emotion. Your mother would be proud of you, you know, the way you've handled all this. Carolyn leaned into her father's embrace. I keep thinking about how close it was, Dad. How one small change in timing and her voice caught. But that didn't happen, Henry reminded her gently. Because that dog out there saw something none of us did. In the yard, Emily had finally tired herself out. She flopped down in the grass, giggling as Rex immediately lay down beside her, his body curled protectively around her small form. The setting sun cast them in a golden glow, the child's blonde curls and the dog's tan markings shining like twin beacons in the evening light. Rex, Henry called. The German shepherd's head lifted instantly, ears forward, eyes alert. Come. For a moment, it seemed as though the old defiance might resurface. Rex looked at Henry, then down at Emily, clearly torn between obeying the command and staying with his charge. It's okay, Rexy, Emily said, patting his head. Go see Grandpa. With this permission granted, Rex trotted to the porch, climbing the steps with dignity. He sat at attention before Henry, his amber eyes meeting the old rancher's gaze directly. Henry knelt down, ignoring the protest from his aging knees, and placed his hands on either side of Rex's powerful neck. You've got a big job ahead of you, boy, he said quietly. That little girl depends on you now. Rex's expression seemed to convey complete understanding. His tail swept once across the porch boards in acknowledgement. Dad, Carolyn said softly, you could come with us. The new house has a guest suite. You could visit whenever you want, stay as long as you like. Henry smiled, but shook his head. My place is here, you know that. But I'll visit, more often than I have been. He looked back to Rex. Gotta check up on this one, make sure he's not getting soft in the city. From the yard, Emily called out, Rexy, come back. Without waiting for permission this time, Rex immediately turned and bounded back down the steps, returning to his post beside the child. He circled her once, nose to the ground as if checking for any dangers, before settling beside her again. You know, Frank said thoughtfully, in all my years of ranching, I've never seen anything quite like that. It's like he knows his purpose now. Henry nodded slowly. That's exactly it. Rex was never meant to be just a ranch dog. He was waiting for something more important. He watched as his granddaughter threw her arms around the dog's neck in a fierce hug, Rex's tail wagging gently in response. Some animals are special that way. They come into our lives for reasons we don't understand until exactly the moment we need them most. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the Texas sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Henry Sullivan felt a deep peace settle over him. The ranch would continue as it always had. Cattle would come and go, seasons would change, but something profound had shifted in the very foundation of Silver Creek. A simple truth had revealed itself through danger and courage. Some bonds transcend explanation, some loyalties run deeper than training, and sometimes the creatures we think we're saving end up saving us instead. In the gathering dusk, Rex stood watch over Emily, his silhouette strong and vigilant against the fading light. No longer the rejected dog, but a guardian who had found his true calling. And in that role, he had finally come home. Give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and if you've watched this far, comment, "I watched to the end," and share your thoughts on this story. Oh, and don't forget to watch the next video that appears on the end screen. It's going to be incredibly emotional.